Dissolved by Cambodia's top court, the main opposition party is urging world powers to cut ties with longtime leader Hun Sen. But China is standing firmly behind him. So, what's behind Cambodia's crackdown on the opposition? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. 65-year-old Hun Sen is one of the world's longest-serving leaders, first taking office as Prime Minister of Cambodia in 1985. Rights groups say that hundreds of opposition figures, journalists, trade union leaders and others have been killed in politically motivated attacks during his time in power. Human Rights Watch says that none of the killings has been investigated credibly. Hun Sen's dominance was challenged in parliamentary elections in 2013. when the newly formed Cambodia National Rescue Party nearly pulled off an upset. But since then, its leaders have either been jailed or gone into exile. And now the Supreme Court has dissolved the party, accepting the government's claim that it conspired with foreigners to stage a revolution. This effectively allows the ruling party to run uncontested in next year's polls. Well, Prime Minister Hun Sen gave an address on state television saying the decision was necessary to maintain peace and political stability. And China has expressed its support of the government. We have a lot to get to with our guests in just a moment. But first, our report from Rob McBride in Phnom Penh.
The death of democracy, that's what it says on the front page of the Phnom Penh Post, but it's the last major English language paper on the stands after the closure of a fellow publication, the Cambodia Daily, a couple of months ago, all part of a general rollback of civil society that it's claimed has been taking place here in recent times. That's also included, according to rights groups, curbs on the activities of some foreign NGOs. At the last election, 3 million people went out and voted for the opposition CNRP, but you'd do well not to admit you were one of them under the current political climate. Did you support the CNRP?
Thank you. Oh, I don't know about that.
We just want to have a good living and the country to develop.
The CNRP leadership has appealed to the international community to intervene, but while there has been condemnation from abroad, it's a very different international community that saved Cambodia from civil war 25 years ago and set it on the path of democracy. Many would argue the United States is not the international player it used to be, and the investment from China that is changing the skyline of Phnom Penh tells you it's the Chinese that are now the biggest influence here. And Beijing certainly likes the way Prime Minister Hun Sen is doing things, with his emphasis on national security and stability, virtues that it approves of the country it calls Brother Cambodia.
So let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Paris, we're joined by Mu Sochua, Vice President of the opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party. From Beijing, Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies. And from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Hosakli Makiyama, Director of the European Center for International Political Economy. Thank you all for being with us. Mu Sochua, let's start with you. You wrote in a newspaper article on Friday that democracy was on trial this week in Cambodia and that it lost. Has the Supreme Court's decision sounded the death knell for democracy in Cambodia?
It was a big blow for democracy in Cambodia, but it's not a fatal blow, because democracy in Cambodia is a huge pool of democratic forces in Cambodia that includes the rural poor, civil servants, the youth, intellectuals, the workers. All of us, we want change. We are the forces that Mr. Hun Sen wants to demolish, and he can't, because it's enshrined in the hearts and in the minds, in the spirits of the Cambodian people for change. Change without bloodshed. Change through 3 fair and inclusive elections.
All right, so the Supreme Court's decision may not have been a knockout blow, but what does it mean for next year's elections?
it is very clear that we can't say from now, from yesterday, even before yesterday, that Mr. Hun Sen is manipulating, is cutting off any chance for free and fair elections in 2018, because Mr. Hun Sen cannot stand any chance at all in 2018 if the opposition party, the democratic forces, are together in 2018. But we are very certain, determined to keep this movement of Democrats in Cambodia going for the sake of democracy, for stability, for our people, because we do not want Mr. Hun Sen, who is a former Khmer Rouge, we do not want to go back to genocide.
It was difficult, as you saw from our report, to ascertain what people think on the streets in Cambodia. Given that the CNRP enjoyed a good deal of support at elections in the country, how do its voters feel about what's happened? What are the implications for the people of Cambodia of the Supreme Court's decision?
At this moment, the voters are keeping their votes for CNRP, the opposition of Cambodia. Yesterday, the trial was supposed to be public trial. However, you saw blockades of police in civilian clothes as well, armed forces. That is all what Mr. Hun Sen wants to say to our people. Demolish their confidence and spread fear with our people. That's not going to happen. We will continue, and we will continue by saying again and again that it is only through the release of Mr. Kem Sokha, our president, the return of all of us, including Mr. Sam Rang Si, and the civil society, independent media, so that we can put democracy back on track. It is not determined by anybody else but by the democratic forces, because we want Cambodia to move forward, and it can move forward. But it has to be rule of law, end of corruption, end of deforestation, end of forced evictions, and so on, so that we can rebuild Cambodia and we can have economic stability, social stability, and political stability that Cambodia deserves.
Victor Gao in Beijing, what's China's view of what happened this week in Cambodia?
No, I think a democracy is always a worthy goal for all the people in all the countries to pursue. But how to really get to democracy and how to promote democracy is a very important question for people in countries like Cambodia to consider, because there may be occasions where the pursuit of so-called democracy may actually end up in loss of social stability, which may bring back greater loss of wealth, of stability, of good well-being for the people. Now, in Cambodia, I was in Cambodia earlier this year, and I saw with my own eyes that there was good rate of economic development. People, generally speaking, were happy with the improvement in their living standards, and I would say that the people at large desire stability and peace and more orderly development of their country. And I think these are the megatrends in Cambodia. Now, of course, in any country, including especially countries like Cambodia, there may be social tensions and social problems and different ways to look at democracy and the pursuit of greater democracy, for example. All these things need to be sorted out by the people in that particular country. China and Cambodia have excellent relations, and China is very much committed to help Cambodia maintain social stability and political stability, so that people in that country, which is a great friendly country to China, can really pursue more peacefully and more leisurely their pursuit of democracy.
Victor, we'll talk more about China's relationship with Cambodia in just a moment. I'll come back to you, bear with me. But both of our other guests on today's programme are shaking their heads as you speak. Musocha, what do you make of what you just heard?
Of course, we want stability. Of course, economic growth. Of course, we're not saying no, but we are saying but not at the cost of human rights, at the cost of the loss of our land, our forests, our natural resources. And it cannot maintain this type of stability if Mr. Hun Sen is going to run Cambodia as a one-party system. And Mr. Hun Sen has not been willing to reform the courts and the judiciary. There is no checks and balances. Look, investments will also depend on a system that works, that is not corrupt. How long can this be maintained? And now, without the challenge of the opposition, without free and fair elections, and if later on, and very soon, there will be sanctions from the Western countries, what is Mr. Hun Sen going to do about the jobs that will be lost in the government sector?
All right.
We are talking about 700,000 workers in these factories.
Hosek Lee,
Yes,
Makiyame in Washington. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Musochua. We'll come back in just a moment. But what do you make of what you've heard so far?
It is true in a sense that China plays a pivotal role in this relationship because in the end, the world community, even where there is a coherence between the EU and the United States, will not achieve actually much of a change of the democratic situation on the ground without actually real cooperation from China. And considering that what we heard now and also what we've seen in the last 20 years is that there are very different, let's say, objectives in terms of what we want to achieve in Cambodia. I think that the extent that we can achieve, for example, through sanction and aid from EU and United States is going to be really limited. This is what we also learned, for example, in the situation in Myanmar in the past and also in other areas where we have had situations, for example, in the Ukraine and Donbass. So essentially, until the situation between China and Cambodia change in either direction, the efforts will be relatively limited.
Victor Gao, I read somewhere that China accounts for 20% of capital spending in Cambodia. I mean, China's worked pretty hard to develop a close relationship with Cambodia. Why? What's in it for Beijing? Is it that Cambodia is China's route to building closer ties with other ASEAN nations?
Well, China-Cambodian relations go back for thousands of years, and there are very deep records, detailed records about how these two countries conducted friendly, good neighborly relations with each other. In more recent decades, of course, when the former King Sihanouk was forced into exile, he was not welcomed by any other country, but then he got huge welcome in China in the 1970s, etc. So in a sense, China back in the 1970s and 80s came to Cambodia's aid and helped the former king restore his rule in Cambodia. And when Cambodia was occupied by Vietnam, China came to the rescue of Cambodia, and China played an indispensable role in helping Cambodia avoiding being assimilated into Vietnam. All these are for the record, and the two countries have ever become very close friends, comrades in arms, as we can say, and all-weather friends, as we sometimes say. And the two countries stand very closely on major regional issues and international issues. Of course, China is the largest contributor in terms of foreign aid or foreign investment in Cambodia. And I would say Cambodia's recent years' economic development is very much thanks to very close cooperation with China. And I think China is proposing major infrastructure projects, connectivity projects, projects aimed at improving the living standards of the people, improving the health standards, improving the education standards, etc., and also making the government more transparent and more accountable to the people. All these are very important measures, and I think China fully respects the internal affairs of Cambodia. And if, for example, democratic elections will come up with results which are different from the allocation of power in Cambodia today, then that's fine. China will accept that fact. But before then, I think China is very firmly promoting more political and social stability in Cambodia rather than intervening in Cambodia domestic affairs by foreign powers. Therefore, I think China believes resorting to asking for foreign powers to be involved in domestic political decisions in Cambodia may be the wrong choice.
Victor, a very brief answer, if you wouldn't mind, please. How then would China view any attempts to bring about targeted sanctions on Cambodia's leaders?
Sanctions will not work as a general rule of principle, and I think China will have nothing to do with the so-called international sanctions, whatever sanctions that may come from any other country. I think China will very much stick with its friendship and cooperation and partnership with Cambodia and come to the rescue of Cambodia again.
Musa Chua, to what extent has the international community's response to what's happened previously in Cambodia contributed to what's happening now? And we mentioned targeted sanctions there. What do you think the international community should do now?
The international community has waited for 25 years for Mr. Hun Sen to reform and given Mr. Hun Sen the chance for economic growth, and there has been economic growth, but at the same time, what we are losing the fundamental values, which is Cambodia cannot move forward without democracy, and Mr. Hun Sen needs the legitimacy from the Western world. And we have in our hands, if we talk about economic growth, how come we have close to 2 million Cambodians working outside of Cambodia as unskilled labor, migrant workers in the neighboring countries like Thailand? So there are economic issues that Mr. Hun Sen will have to address. And there are, don't forget, youth who represent 70% of this population in Cambodia that are not going to wait when they see their parents losing their land, being forced out of their land, and they have to go seek employment at the lowest gains for their parents. They will have to say, no, we want change. And that's how we, the National Rescue Party, CNRP, continues to make gains. And that's what we talk about, democratic change without interference from the rest of the world. However, the international community, including China, we want a world in peace. Yes.
Hosekli Makiyama.
Security, yes.
Okay.
But human rights as well.
Okay. Hosekli Makiyama in Washington. Victor Gao says that targeted sanctions won't work. Would they make any difference? And what further steps, if the international community decided to go down that road, what further steps could it take after sanctions if China refuses to abide by them?
Well, let me put it this way. I think Mr. Gao is absolutely right in the sense that there are strong economic relations with China, but I think he's slightly mistaken about the counterpart on the Cambodian side. It's not necessarily with the Cambodian economy, but it's actually with Mr. Hun Sen and also the People's Party. If you look at the Cambodian economy as a whole, if you look at the people, it is mostly dependent on trade with Europe. About 5 billion of the Cambodian export is actually going to Europe thanks to the duty-free and quota-free arrangements we have arranged for the least developing countries. And the Cambodian has been one of the main beneficiaries of that the arrangement. And now, if you look at what that number actually entails, it's actually the quarter of the entire Cambodian economy. And if you look at key sectors, for example, like textiles, most of the export actually go to Europe. And so in that sense, the real economic link is between actually Europe and Cambodia. So China's trade with actually Cambodia is relatively limited. There are, of course, financial links, but these are primarily with the leadership of the People's Party. And that's very, very different. And which is also one of the reasons why if we would have asset freezes or visa bans for the leadership of Cambodia, it is very likely that it would have relatively limited effect aside from the naming and the shaming of the People's Party leadership, including Mr. Hun Sen. And the next step, which is going to be the big and the nuclear option, is actually trade sanctions. And at that stage, we will see that the entire economy will start to suffer.
Okay. Well, the European Union has warned that fundamental human rights should be respected to assure Cambodia's duty-free access to the bloc's markets. EU countries, as we were hearing, accounted for around 40% of Cambodia's exports last year, mainly clothes. The US gives similar preferences for garments made in Cambodia and bought 30% of its clothing exports last year, but China is Cambodia's largest financial backer in terms of investment aid and soft loans, as we were hearing. Hosakli Makiyama, then, if the EU, for instance, were to push for sanctions from Brussels, would there be any pushback, given that trade, from other European nations? And what about the US? Any appetite to impose sanctions against Cambodia from Washington?
Well, both EU and US sanctions nowadays tend to go towards actions that are aimed at the leadership rather than the workers. Because what we have noticed in the last decade is that actually many autocratic leaders actually don't care about their workers. They don't actually care about their people. They don't care about the young. So in other words, if you are starting to enforce economic sanctions and actually revoking these trade preferences under GSP in the United States and what we call the EBA, everything but arms, where actually Cambodia can export anything duty-free and quota-free to Europe and practically also to the United States except arms, it is going to you're going to find yourself in a situation you're actually revoking the trade preferences for the workers and the people rather than actually the leadership. And as I said, in a situation where an autocratic leader doesn't actually care about its worker, it can't sustain itself for many years. This is what happened in Sri Lanka. This is what happened in Myanmar. And therefore, I think the immediate effect of the sanction is going to be mostly about diplomacy and also in terms of Cambodia's standing in the international community. And I think given that Cambodia has already oriented itself so close to China, it keeps constantly blocking regional initiative for dialogue, for example, on border disputes on behalf of China, and is already voting almost as a proxy state in, for example, organization like ASEAN. It will be very difficult to achieve that naming and shaming because it's in fact already there.
Okay. Mus Sachwa, are you concerned that your call for sanctions, I mean, if they're implemented, it may merely push Cambodia further into the arms of China?
No, we're talking about targeted sanctions as step number one. Yes, Mr. Hun Sen, his cronies, his families have assets outside of the United States, not in China, in the United States, in Australia, in France, but not in China. They are not going to have, they're not getting their education in China, they're getting their education in the United States. The son of Mr. Hun Sen went to West Point. So that's the point, the legitimacy of the West, the education from the West. They are going, when they're sick, they don't go to China, they go to Singapore, they come to France, they go to Australia. They don't go to China except the highest level. But their children go shopping in the United States, in Australia. It will affect them. That's the first step.
Okay.
Now we are saying, first step, think about it, Mr. Hun Sen. There's still time for us to talk about national reconciliation. Among Cambodians, let's have a dialogue. We're not going all the way, but step by step, it might get there, that China, even China, cannot help. Because as studies show, exports is to the West, to the EU, not to China. It's economic survival of our people every day is in the West.
There, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. We're out of time. Thank you to all of our guests on the program today, Mus Sachwa, Victor Gao and Hosakli Makiyama. Thank you for watching. Don't forget, you can see the program at any time just by visiting the website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.